The air in Mr. Harrison's office was the first thing I noticed. It was unnaturally still, chilled to a precise temperature that felt designed to preserve documents rather than comfort human beings. It smelled faintly of expensive leather and industrial-grade carpet cleaner, an antiseptic aroma that seemed to leach the very oxygen from my lungs. I sat opposite him, a vast, polished mahogany desk separating us like a barricade. On its surface lay a single sheet of paper, a bank statement that had become the obituary for my life. Balance, $9.87. The number was an absurdity, a cruel joke. $9.87, the cost of a sandwich and a coffee. It was all that remained of $253,428. My inheritance meticulously saved. The earnings from 5 years of working 2, sometimes 3 jobs. The foundation of the future my fiancé Mark and I were supposed to build. "I'm sorry, Miss Vance," Mr. Harrison repeated, his voice a low, practiced murmur of sympathy that held no real warmth. He was a man in a tailored suit playing a role. "The transfer was initiated at 11:42 a.m. 2 days ago. It was a single wire for the full amount in the joint savings account. According to our records, all security protocols were met. It was authorized by you. We have the signed paperwork right here." He slid a second document across the acres of gleaming wood. It was thick, creamy paper, the kind reserved for important, life-altering agreements. And there, at the bottom of a page, dense with impenetrable legalese, was my signature, Ilara Vance. It was a familiar, optimistic loop, the signature of a woman in love, a woman who trusted implicitly, a fool. I remembered the moment with a clarity that was physically painful. Mark had burst into our apartment, his face flushed with excitement, waving the document like a winning lottery ticket. "Babe, it's the last thing we need for the mortgage on the house in Crestwood. The dream house." He'd smelled of expensive cologne and ambition. He'd kissed me, a quick, distracting press of his lips to mine, and held out his favorite silver pen. "Just sign here and here. It's just standard indemnity clauses for the bank." I had been in the middle of cooking dinner, his dinner, after a 10-hour shift at the law firm. I'd wiped my hands on my apron, taken the pen, and signed without reading a word. Why would I have read it? It was for us. For our dream house. I trusted him with my money, my future, my heart. They were, I had thought, all the same thing. "The funds were wired to a corporate account," Mr. Harrison continued, oblivious to the silent movie of my own stupidity playing in my head. "An entity called Innovate Next Technologies." The name hit me like a physical blow. Mark's company. His startup. The all-consuming project I had supported with my labor, my faith, and now my entire financial existence. My breath hitched. The carefully refrigerated air in the office suddenly felt thick and suffocating. My heart began to beat a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. A trapped bird trying to break free. A cold sweat prickled my hairline and the back of my neck. The edges of my vision started to swim in a gray, fuzzy haze. This was it. The feeling. The crushing weight of absolute and total betrayal. The physiological prelude to a complete collapse. I had been here before. In another life, this precise moment, the sterile office, the pitying bank manager, the damning signature, was the beginning of my end. This was the shock that would curdle into a stress so profound, it would eventually stop my heart. But as the familiar wave of panic rose, threatening to drown me, something else surfaced from the depths. It was a memory, but sharper than a memory. It was a lived experience, an echo in my bones. An ice-cold, preternatural calm began to spread through my veins, pushing back against the hysteria. It's happening again. The thought wasn't mine so much as it was a fact, an immutable law of the universe asserting itself. The script was playing out, word for word, action for action. But there was one critical difference, one variable that had changed the entire equation. This time, I remembered how the story ended. And this time, I would be the one to write the final chapter. The walk from the bank was a journey through a city that no longer felt real. The sounds of traffic, the press of the crowd, the bright September sunlight, it all felt like a complex simulation designed to test my sanity. My first life, my other life, was no longer a hazy nightmare I'd woken from years ago. It was a high-definition replay, every painful detail accessible and excruciatingly clear. My feet moved automatically, taking me not to the apartment I shared with Mark, but to a small park, a patch of green amid the concrete and steel. I sat on a hard, cold bench and let the two timelines of my existence converge. Our story had started as a campus fairy tale. I was the quiet, studious literature major, content with my world of books and poetry. He was the brilliant, charismatic business student, the one everyone knew was destined for greatness. He didn't just have ideas, he had a vision. His project, Innovate Next, was going to revolutionize data security. He spoke about it with a burning, infectious passion, and I, a moth to his flame, was completely drawn in. He saw something in me, he said, a stillness and a strength that grounded him. I believed him. I became his anchor, his confidant, his biggest supporter. After graduation, supporting his dream became my life's purpose. While he spent his days in frantic meetings with venture capitalists and his nights coding, I worked. I took a grueling job as a paralegal. The long hours and meticulous, soul-crushing work, a penance I paid for his future success. At night, I'd trade my sensible work shoes for comfortable sneakers and sling cocktails at a noisy downtown bar, the tips I earned going straight into the joint account he managed. "Every dollar is a brick in the palace we're going to build, Ellie," he'd say, kissing my tired brow when I'd get home long after he was asleep. The first real brick was my inheritance. My grandparents had been frugal, hardworking people, and they'd left me just over $100,000, a sum that felt staggering to me. It was my safety net, the one thing in the world that was mine and mine alone. Mark saw it differently. He saw it as dormant potential. I remembered the conversation perfectly now, a scene replaying from a life I'd lived before. We were in our first tiny apartment, eating takeout pizza off paper plates because we hadn't had time to wash the dishes. "It's just sitting there in some low-yield bond fund," he'd said, gesturing with a piece of crust. "It's lazy money, babe. I could make it work for us. The pre-seed funding round is closing, and if I can go in with a stronger position, I can retain more equity. This isn't about me, it's about our net worth." He'd framed it as a partnership, a brilliant financial strategy. He made it sound like I was being selfish by hoarding it. He'd leaned across the table, his eyes sincere, his voice a low, persuasive thrum. "Trust me, Alara, when have I ever steered you wrong?" I hadn't been able to answer. I'd transferred the money the next day. That was the beginning of his total control over our finances. He set up the accounts, he managed the investments. Whenever I'd asked to see a statement, he'd produce a charming, dismissive smile. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about the boring numbers. That's my job. Your job is to believe in me." And like a fool, I did. His mother, Catherine, reinforced the dynamic. She was a woman who wore her wealth like armor, her sharp, assessing gaze always making me feel underdressed and inadequate. She treated my support for Mark not as a loving partnership, but as my designated function. I was a necessary, if somewhat common, piece of equipment for his ascent. I remembered one excruciating dinner at her country club. I had worn my best dress, a simple black sheath I'd bought on sale. Catherine had looked me up and down, a faint, pitying smile on her lips. "That's a sweet little dress, dear," she'd said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "It's wonderful that you don't feel the need to be competitive in your appearance." Later, when Mark was boasting about a breakthrough in his algorithm, I'd tried to add a detail he'd told me about. Catherine had cut me off, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my arm. "Let the men talk business, Alara. Why don't you tell me where you find the time to work 2 jobs? It sounds simply exhausting." She made my hard work sound like a grubby hobby. Mark had just laughed, basking in her adoration, leaving me to twist in the wind. In my first life, this pattern of subtle dismissals, of being made to feel small and financially inept, culminated in the scene at the bank. The text message from Mark had arrived an hour later. "Something came up. I've met someone else. Someone who gets my world. I'm sorry, I've left some cash on the counter for you. $200. A tip for 5 years of my life." The woman he left me for was Allegra Vander Woodson, an heiress whose father was on the board of a major investment bank. It all made perfect, brutal sense. I was the bootstrap funding. She was the final stage rocket booster. The months that followed were a blur of shame and desperation. I was evicted. I sold my car, then my grandmother's jewelry, then my dignity. I watched from the gutter as Mark became a media darling. Innovate Next had its IPO and became the unicorn of the year. Mark, my Mark, was on the cover of every business magazine, his arm around a beaming Allegra, the new golden couple of the tech world. The end for me came on a cold, damp night in a homeless shelter. My phone, the last possession I had of any value, had 3% battery left. I scrolled through a news feed, my thumb smudged with dirt. And then I saw it. The headline that brought a grim, fleeting smile to my face. Innovate Next CEO Mark Thorne arrested in massive fraud scandal. The story detailed a complete fabrication. The tech was smoke and mirrors, the revenue numbers pure fiction. His billion-dollar empire was a ghost. They showed a picture of him being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief. The vindication was a weak, watery thing. It couldn't warm me, it couldn't feed me, it couldn't heal the profound systemic stress that had ravaged my body. I lay down on the thin plastic mattress, the knowledge of his downfall my only solace, and I simply stopped. My last thought was a burning, useless wish, a wish for another chance. To have known then what I knew now, and the universe, in its cruel, inexplicable sense of humor, had granted it. I'd woken up screaming in my teenage bedroom, the memory of that cold shelter floor more real than the soft sheets around me. I had relived the last decade in a state of constant, low-grade dread, a passenger in my own life. I'd made small changes, but the big currents were too strong. I fell in love with Mark all over again, telling myself the first life was an anxiety dream, a warning my subconscious had concocted. I let myself believe that this time, his love was real. This time, the dream we were building was genuine. Until today. Today, the dream was revealed to be the same nightmare. But sitting on that park bench, the chilly autumn air on my skin, the grief began to recede, replaced by something harder and infinitely more powerful. Rage. It was a cold, clean rage that burned away the tears and the fear. This wasn't a curse. It wasn't a tragic loop. It was an opportunity. An opportunity for justice. He had been given a second chance to do the right thing and had chosen, once again, to be a monster. I had been given a second chance to be a victim. I was declining the offer. I stood up from the bench, my back straight, my hands clenched into fists. He thought he had my money. He thought he had my future. He was wrong. All he had was a head start. My first life had given me the tragedy. My second life would be about the revenge. The first step was survival, which required severing the final ties to my old life. I went back to the apartment, his apartment now, and moved with a cold, robotic efficiency. I ignored the 17 missed calls and 28 frantic texts from him, a calculated performance of a concerned fiancé wanting to know where I was. I packed one suitcase with my clothes, my personal documents, and my laptop. I left behind everything he had ever given me. The jewelry, the books, the life we had built. It was all tainted, part of a stage play in which I had been the unwitting fool. In the back of my jewelry box, nestled beneath a pair of cheap earrings he'd given me for our anniversary, was the one thing of true value. My grandfather's coin. A 1913 Liberty Head nickel hanging on a thin silver chain. In my first life, in the depths of my despair, I had sold it to a pawn shop owner for $500. I remembered his eyes glittering with greed. This time, I knew its true worth. It wasn't just a rainy day fund, it was a war chest. With my single bag and the coin tucked safely in my pocket, I walked out, leaving his key on the gleaming granite countertop. I didn't slam the door, I closed it softly, a quiet, final click that echoed with the death of my love and the birth of my purpose. I used my credit card, one he didn't know about with a small $5,000 limit I'd kept for emergencies, to check into a cheap, anonymous motel on the outskirts of the city. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach, but it was a fortress. It was my base of operations. From there, I began my new life's work. My first task was to turn the coin into capital. I couldn't just walk into a collector's shop. I needed the right buyer, the right price, and absolute discretion. I spent 2 days at a public library diving deep into the rarefied world of numismatics. I learned that the last public sale of a 1913 Liberty Head nickel had fetched over $4 million. My heart hammered in my chest. This was real. This could work. I found the name of the man who had authenticated that coin. Professor Alistair Finch, a semi-retired academic at Yale University, widely regarded as the foremost authority on rare American currency. Finding his university email address was easy. Composing the email was agonizing. I wrote and rewrote it a dozen times, terrified of sounding like a crank or a fraud. Finally, I settled on a short professional message. Dear Professor Finch, my name is Alara Vance. I am writing to you as I believe I am in possession of an unrecorded 6th 1913 Liberty Head nickel, passed down through my family. I have attached high-resolution photographs for your initial review. I would be deeply grateful for your expert opinion and any advice you could offer on a discreet and professional authentication process. I attached the photos, took a deep breath, and hit send. The 3 days I waited for a reply were the longest of my life. I barely slept, jumping every time my phone buzzed. I was plagued with doubt. What if it was a fake? What if my grandfather had been telling a tall tale? What if the professor just deleted my email as spam? The reply came at 2:17 a.m. on the third night. My phone buzzed on the nightstand and I snatched it up. The subject line was simply, your inquiry. Miss Vance, the photographs are compelling. Extraordinarily so. The dye characteristics appear consistent with the known specimens. Of course, a physical examination is required to be certain. I am connected with a small number of serious private collectors who would treat this matter with the utmost gravity and discretion. If you are willing to travel to New Haven, I will clear my schedule. This could be a truly historic find. Regards, Alistair Finch. Tears of relief streamed down my face. It was real. My grandfather had left me a lifeline. 2 days later, I was on a train to New Haven, the coin in a small box tucked into the deepest corner of my bag. Professor Finch was a kind, elderly man with twinkling eyes and a magnifying glass permanently attached to a chain around his neck. He handled the coin with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic. After an hour of intense scrutiny in his quiet, book-lined office, he looked up at me over his spectacles, his face beaming. "My dear girl," he said, his voice trembling with excitement, "this is it. It's absolutely genuine. It is, without a doubt, the find of a lifetime." The transaction that followed was a blur of quiet efficiency. Professor Finch arranged a meeting with a representative for a notoriously private Swiss billionaire. There was no haggling. They knew what it was, and they were prepared to pay for it and for the silence surrounding its acquisition. I signed a sheaf of non-disclosure agreements. A wire transfer was initiated. The next morning, I walked out of a local bank in New Haven with a certified check for $2,800,000. The sheer unreality of it was staggering. Less than 2 weeks ago, I had been a ruined woman with $9 to her name. Now, I was a multimillionaire. But there was no joy in it, no sense of triumph yet. This wasn't a lottery win. It was ammunition. Back in my motel room, I mapped out the next phase. The Innovate Next IPO was now just over a week away. The financial world was buzzing with anticipation. I spent every waking moment transforming myself from a paralegal into a predator. I opened a new, high-level trading account with a brokerage firm that catered to high-net-worth, high-risk clients. I devoured books on derivatives trading. I watched hours of tutorials on short selling, put options, and leverage. The complex financial instruments that had once seemed so intimidating became my new language, my new weapons. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Mark had always made me feel like an idiot when it came to money. Now, I was preparing to use his own world, the world of high finance, to utterly destroy him. The day of the IPO, I watched from the sterile solitude of my motel room. I saw him on television, ringing the opening bell at the stock exchange, Allegra on his arm, his mother beaming behind him. He was the king of the world, a tech visionary, a self-made billionaire on paper. They drank champagne as the stock, ticker NVX, opened at $25 a share and rocketed to over $60 before the closing bell. He was a genius, a hero, a fraud. While they partied, I executed my plan. I didn't just short the stock, I bought put options. It was a riskier, more aggressive strategy. A put option is a bet that a stock will fall below a certain price by a certain date. If you're right, your profits are magnified exponentially. If you're wrong, you lose your entire investment. I bought thousands of contracts, all with a strike price of $10, expiring in 3 months. To any sane investor, it was madness. The stock was trading at $60 and climbing. For my bet to pay off, Innovate Next would have to lose more than 80% of its value. It was an impossible, absurd bet for anyone who didn't know what I knew. I wired my entire fortune, every last cent of the $2.8 million into that one single trade. The broker on the other end of the line, a man named Gavin, actually called me to confirm. Ma'am, I am obligated to inform you that this is an exceptionally high-risk position. You stand to lose the entirety of your principal. Are you certain you wish to proceed? I am certain, I said, my voice as cold and steady as a frozen lake. Execute the trade. For the next 2 months, I lived in a self-imposed purgatory. The world fell deeper in love with Mark Thorne. InVX soared, buoyed by faked product demos and glowing paid-for analyst reports. It hit $70, then $85, then a breathtaking $104 a share. Every dollar it climbed was a paper loss for me, a figure on a screen that screamed I was a fool. My account balance was a terrifying river of red ink. The brokerage firm issued margin calls, demanding more funds to cover the potential losses. I sold the expensive watch my father had given me for my college graduation. I sold my laptop and started using the computers at the public library again. I moved out of the motel and into a tiny, windowless room in a boarding house, the kind of place where you didn't ask your neighbors what they did for a living. I lived on instant noodles, bread, and tap water. My life became a grim echo of my first one's decline. But this time, the deprivation was a choice. It was a strategy. It was a sharpening stone for my rage. Every day I would see pictures of Mark and Allegra on social media, on a yacht in the Caribbean, at a charity gala in Paris, sitting courtside at a Lakers game. They were living a life of impossible glamour, funded by my stolen money and the deception of thousands of investors. One of his posts was a picture of him and Allegra in front of their new mansion, the very house in Crestwood he had pretended we were buying together. The caption read, "Finally home, some things are worth any price." That night, the doubt almost broke me. The red numbers on my screen swam before my eyes. My stomach ached with hunger. I was alone, destitute, and betting everything on a memory. What if I was wrong? What if, in this timeline, he somehow got away with it? The temptation to cut my losses, to salvage what little was left and just disappear was immense. But then, I remembered the cold floor of the shelter. I remembered the hollow ache of dying alone and forgotten, and my resolve hardened from steel into diamond. I would see this through to the end. I had one more card to play, one more piece of knowledge from my first life. It was a drunken, arrogant confession from Mark, whispered to me late one night after a company party. He'd been bragging about the impenetrable security of his platform. "It's a digital fortress," he'd slurred, his breath sour with expensive whiskey. "But every good castle has a secret passage, right? A postern gate? I built a master kill switch into the core code, a backdoor only I know about. I could literally burn the whole company to the ground with a single keystroke." He'd laughed, thinking it was a huge joke. He'd told me the ridiculously complex command string, something he'd named after a spaceship in his favorite sci-fi movie. He was so proud of his own cleverness. I, his trusting partner, had thought it was just another of his geeky quirks, and had typed it into the Notes app on my phone under the heading Mark's Stuff. I had backed up that phone to the cloud for years. The note was still there. The night before the date of the expose, a date seared into my memory, I made my final move. This was my contribution to his downfall, my personal touch. I went to a 24-hour university library, paid for a guest pass in cash, and found a computer in a remote carrel. Using a chain of encrypted networks and a temporary VPN, I navigated to the Innovate Next developer portal. His password, in a feat of staggering arrogance, was a combination of his own name and his dog's. I was in within seconds. I didn't use the kill switch he'd built. That would be too simple, too clean. It would look like sabotage. My plan was more elegant. I wanted the world to see him for what he was, a common thief. I navigated through the system architecture, my heart pounding with adrenaline, until I found what I was looking for, the real servers, the ones not meant for investors' eyes. There it was, the entire fraud laid bare. The real balance sheets showing massive losses, internal emails between him and his CFO discussing the fabrication of revenue, memos detailing how they faked the revolutionary tech demos using clever editing and pre-rendered graphics. It was the complete blueprint of his crime. I downloaded everything, a massive encrypted file of pure corporate malfeasance. I composed 2 anonymous emails. The first went to David Chen, the Wall Street Chronicle reporter who I knew was already working on the story. My message was simple. You're on the right track with Innovate Next. Here's the proof. Check the internal financials against the SEC filings. Happy hunting. The second email with the same file attached went directly to the public whistleblower tip line at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I hit send, wiped the computer's temporary files, and walked out into the pre-dawn chill. The trap was set. All I had to do now was watch. I spent that final night in my tiny room, not sleeping. The sun rose. I made a cup of instant coffee, the last of my supply, and sat in front of my borrowed secondhand laptop, the trading platform open. At exactly 7 a.m. Eastern Time, it happened. The Wall Street Chronicle's website updated. The headline was a cannon shot, Innovate Next, a billion-dollar house of cards built on lies. David Chen's article was a masterpiece of financial journalism, a brutal, systematic demolition of Mark's entire company. And it was filled with quotes from internal documents that he should have had no way of accessing. He had my proof. At 7:30 a.m., a second bombshell dropped. The SEC issued a press release announcing they were halting all trading of INVX stock, citing credible evidence of significant accounting fraud. The pre-market trading was a massacre. The ticker was frozen, but the bids had vanished. There were only sellers, a tidal wave of them, all screaming for the exits at once. At 9:30 a.m., the market opened. Trading on INVX resumed. It was not a decline, it was an amputation. The stock, which had closed the previous day at a triumphant $104.38, reopened at $15, and it kept falling. $10, $5, $1. It was a waterfall, a black hole, a feeding frenzy. My brokerage account, the screen that had shown me nothing but catastrophic losses for 2 agonizing months, began to flash. The numbers, once a deep, sickening red, turned green. They weren't just green. They were a blinding electric emerald. The value of my put options, my insane suicidal bet, was skyrocketing. For every dollar the stock fell, my profits multiplied in a way that defied logic. The numbers climbed so fast my brain couldn't process them. 1 million, 10 million, 50 million, 100 million. I watched, not with glee, but with a strange, detached calm. My heart wasn't pounding. It was beating with a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. This wasn't a victory, it was an execution. Live news channels were now cutting into their regular programming. They had cameras outside the gleaming glass tower of the Innovate Next headquarters. Black SUVs with government plates screeched to a halt at the curb. Agents from the FBI, jackets flapping in the wind, swarmed into the lobby. A few minutes later, they emerged, flanking Mark, and he was in handcuffs. His perfectly tailored suit was rumpled. His usually coiffed hair was a mess. His face, the handsome, confident face that had graced magazine covers and charmed billions of dollars from investors, was a slack mask of utter shock. He looked lost, pathetic, a child who had just been told the game was over. As they pushed him into the back of a black car, his eyes met the camera for a brief second. There was no defiance in them, only a hollow, bottomless confusion. By the time the closing bell rang, INVX stock was trading at 12 cents a share. It was, for all intents and purposes, worthless. The company was gone. The empire had crumbled to dust in less than 8 hours. I logged into my brokerage account one last time for the day and looked at the final tally. The number sat there, serene and absolute. $412,784,902. A few days later, a frantic, desperate knock rattled the thin door of my boarding house room. I knew it was him. He must have spent a fortune on a bail bondsman and a private investigator to find me in this urban wasteland. I opened the door. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. The vibrant, arrogant energy that had always surrounded him was gone, replaced by a twitchy, feral desperation. He started talking before I could say a word, the words tumbling out in a pathetic, rehearsed torrent. It was all a mistake, a misunderstanding. His CFO had misled him. His competitors had framed him. It was all for us, for our future. He even tried to take my hand. I let him exhaust himself, his lies growing more and more fantastic. When he finally trailed off, his shoulders slumped, his eyes pleading for a lifeline, I just looked at him. I felt nothing. No pity, no lingering love, no satisfaction. Only a profound, clinical distance. "You're a terrible liar, Mark," I said, my voice quiet. "You always were. I just never wanted to see it." I held up my phone and played the audio recording I'd made. It was from a call with a mutual friend, a woman Mark had once tried to hit on. I'd asked her to call Catherine and ask about me and to record the call. Catherine's shrill, gloating voice filled the tiny room. Such a relief, Mark finally dropped that dead weight. Honestly, she was holding him back. Some people are just born to be mediocre, you know? I heard she's practically destitute now. It's for the best. He's with a woman of his own class now. Mark flinched, the color draining from his already pale face. Then, I turned the phone around and showed him a screenshot. A screenshot of my brokerage account balance from the day his company imploded. He stared at it. His eyes traced the long string of numbers, his lips moving silently as he tried to count the commas. The dawning comprehension on his face was a slow, agonizing sunrise of horror. He understood. He didn't know how, but he knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was my doing. His ruin was my design. "You didn't just steal my savings, Mark," I said, my voice still a quiet, level blade. "You stole my life. You left me with nothing. You thought I was dead weight. So I decided to prove you right." I let that hang in the air for a moment. "I took the weight of all your lies, all your betrayals, and I dropped it on your head. Enjoy prison." I closed the door in his face, not with a slam, but with a soft, final click. I leaned my back against it, listening to the sound of his ragged, broken breathing on the other side. Then, he was gone. And for the first time in 2 lives, I was completely and utterly free. The year that followed was not about spending the money, but about learning to live with the peace it had bought me. Wealth on that scale is its own kind of burden. A responsibility I took with the gravity my grandfather would have expected. I hired a team of discreet, older financial advisors who specialized in quiet money, and together we built a fortress of trusts and diversified ethical investments. My goal was not to live lavishly, but to live without fear. I left the city, the scene of both my ruin and my revenge, and bought a restored brownstone in a quiet, historic neighborhood in Philadelphia. It had a small library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a walled garden in the back, where I planted roses and lavender. It was a house built for peace, not for show. The first thing I did was call my parents and my sister. I told them a simplified version of the truth, that a shrewd investment had paid off in a way I never could have imagined. They had been worried sick, alienated by Mark's dismissive attitude towards them for years. Rebuilding those bridges, hearing the genuine joy in their voices, was worth more than any number in my bank account. My most important project was the Phoenix Foundation. I endowed it with $100 million, creating a permanent, powerful resource for victims of domestic financial abuse. We provided pro bono legal services, financial counseling, emergency housing, and grants for women looking to restart their lives after being financially wiped out by a partner. I remained an anonymous donor, but I sat on the advisory board under my mother's maiden name. I would listen to the stories, women whose husbands had secretly run up 6 figures of debt in their name, women whose partners had drained their business accounts, women who were left, as I had been, with nothing but shame and terror. Helping them forge their own second chances became the purpose of my new life. The news of Mark and Catherine's fates trickled in over time. small, satisfying footnotes to my own story. Mark's trial was a public spectacle. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had provided, he was convicted on all counts. The judge, a stern older woman who seemed personally offended by his arrogance, gave him the maximum sentence: 25 years in a federal medium security prison. His appeals were denied. His name became a cautionary tale in business schools, a synonym for hubris and fraud. Catherine's downfall was less dramatic, but in some ways more complete. While she wasn't charged with a crime, her complicity was made clear during the trial. She was a social pariah. Her friends, the ones who had smiled with her at the country club, now crossed the street to avoid her. Stripped of her son's stolen fortune, the banks foreclosed on her mansion. Her assets were seized. The last I heard of her, from a gossipy acquaintance, she was selling a questionable line of anti-aging skincare on a late-night home shopping network. Her face a strained mask of false enthusiasm, a ghost haunting the airwaves where her son was once king. One cool autumn evening, about a year after I'd closed the door on Mark, I was sitting in my garden. A mug of hot tea warmed my hands, and the scent of damp earth and late-blooming roses filled the air. I thought about the impossible path my life had taken, the strange and violent miracle of a second chance. I had not just been given the opportunity to escape my fate. I had been given the power to rewrite it. I had taken the deepest trauma of my existence and transformed it into a tool of perfect poetic justice. The world knew Mark Thorne as a disgraced con man, but only I would ever know the full truth. That he had been ruined by the quiet, bookish woman he had dismissed as dead weight, a ghost from a life he never knew he'd already destroyed. And in the peaceful solitude of my new reality, I finally understood that my revenge wasn't the money or his downfall. It was this: the quiet garden, the warm tea, the unshakable, profound, and absolute peace of being the sole author of my own life.